Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Everybody, welcome to episode 99 of the podcast. I'm Nick, I'm your host, and in this episode, I talk with Michayla White, Interim Executive Director at INCM. Most people are familiar with them because of the Children's Pastors Conference, but Michayla and I talk about millennial parents, reaching millennial parents, a survey she did for millennial parents of faith, and asking them about their parenting and their values and their priorities, and even what that looks like at church. What are their values and priorities at church and their own faith, all of that. And this is an important topic, obviously, because millennials are the largest age group out there right now. So as a church, you're trying to reach your community, trying to reach families, trying to reach young families. Well, then you're trying to reach millennial parents. So it's a great conversation. I love the passion that Michayla has for millennial parents and reaching them and the survey that she did. So we dive into that and kind of talk about all the insights from the survey. As usual, you can get the notes and everything at nickblevins.com/episode 99 in just a week. So next week is the Orange Conference. Some of you might be there. If you are, let me know. I'll be there. I'd love to connect, meet you if we haven't met before. That'd be great. I'll be helping with a breakout for Next Gen pastors. So those of you that are Next Gen pastors, I'll be part of the Developing a Next Gen Strategy breakout. I get to talk about developing a volunteer strategy for all of Next Gen. So that'll be fun. I get to do that along some friends of mine who are Next Gen pastors who are just amazing leaders. So as always, I look forward to the Orange Conference. The thing I look forward to the most is people, just networking, connecting, talking with folks that I, for the most part, probably only see at conferences. And so I'm looking forward to that. If you're going to be there, let me know. But without further ado, let's jump in now to my conversation with Michayla White about reaching millennial parents. Well, today I'm talking with Michayla White, Interim Director at INCM. Welcome to the podcast, Michayla.
Thanks, Nick. I'm glad to be here.
So tell us a little about you and your family and the work you do with INCM.
Oh, goodness. Well, my family, I'm married to my childhood sweetheart. We met when we were 12 and been married coming up on our 8-year anniversary. So I'm excited to celebrate that. And we have 2 little boys. I have a 4-year-old named Declan. He's turning 5 in September, and he is hilarious. I think he's going to be an engineer, just the way that his brain works. And then Zeke is our 1-year-old turning 2 in just a couple of weeks. And we kind of like to describe Zeke like a blender with the top off. You kind of know when Zeke is in the room. So they're a blast. And yeah, we are in the Chicago suburbs. So I just apologize ahead of time for my Chicago accent. It's not like the joy of listening to a British accent or a nice Southern one. But born and raised in Chicago, and I'm a Cubs fan. So that's a little bit about us. And I've been able to serve in children's and family ministry for almost 11 years now, vocationally, but I've been a volunteer since I was in middle school. And here at INCM, I get to serve as the interim executive director. And what that looks like is just making sure that this beautiful vision to see children's and family ministry leaders equipped and inspired and resourced to be able to do what God has called them to do, it happens. And so we do that through a lot of different ways. I think we're most well known for Children's Pastors Conference, which is this really incredible gathering of leaders from around the globe, really in Orlando, Florida every year. And it's just 3 incredible days of training and inspiration and connecting with leaders. And then we also have a monthly membership site called kidman.com that resources leaders. And I think it's nice in that I feel like it just gives you time back to focus on things that matter. And then we also have a certification program, and we do a lot of online events and webinars, and just love to get to run alongside this community. They're heroes. So we're just committed to being able to serve them, and it's a real privilege.
Now, remind me, how old is INCM? It's one of the longest running, considered parachurch children's ministry organizations.
See, this is the thing. Yeah, this is the thing I love so much about this organization. It's been around for almost 40 years and was started by a couple children's ministry leaders in Colorado who just looked at each other and said, hey, this would go a lot better if we did this together and learned from each other. And so, I mean, that's really started in the hands of the community, and it's really driven by, where discipleship for kids and families needs to go. And, it's a beautiful story of a community coming together around the things that we're really passionate about and the things that really matter.
That's great. Well, we're going to talk all about millennial parents, and I know that's something you're passionate about. You've been researching and doing work on. So, but before you have any conversation about millennials, the question I have is, who are millennials? Because I feel like I see different birth ranges and, descriptions and all that. So how would you describe that? And even with your research, what did you focus on age-wise?
Yeah. So one of the things that is interesting with any sort of generational research that's important to keep in mind is that a generational cohort, when it's designed, it's really just a tool to be able to analyze changes in views over time. And so you're going to see different researchers identify the span differently. So like most recently, Pew Research in March said that they're landing the plane for themselves of what that actually is. And so they've identified 1981 to 1996 is the generational cutoff for millennials. And the Census Bureau would say 1982 to 2000. So when I'm talking to a group of people, I'll pretty much say early 1980s to mid 1990s is usually where I will land in that, because it's a pretty healthy span. Like a generational span is usually 18 years. So Pew's identified this one as about 16, and it seems to hold up pretty well.
Now, tell us a little bit about the survey you conducted. Like, who took the survey? Did you specify an age range on there, or did you?
We did. Yep,
you did. What did you say?
We only accepted surveys from parents that identified being born after 1980. So parents between 1980 and 1998, I think, was the specification on that. So we had about 80 parents respond to this survey. And I think it's important to say right off the bat, this was exploratory. This is not a substantive or statistically, you want at least 30% of a representative group. So we're nowhere close, but I think it's a good start in terms of understanding some interesting distinctives of this particular group. But yeah, so 1980 to about 1998.
And what led you to want to do the survey? You know what I mean? Like, what questions were you thinking about? What kind of drove that?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that when you wrestle with what children's ministry looks like today and how much we desire to see kids come to know and love and serve Jesus, we know how important it is to be able to come alongside their parents. And when we wrestle with the truths of where it feels like church attendance is at today, and even just the things that we hear in the media about really these emerging adults of millennials, I think when I was wrestling with these truths and what felt like the trajectory of my generation, I really started to wonder about millennial parents in particular, because I'm thinking about the leaders in the church who are passionate about the discipleship of these kids. And those of us who serve in Kidman know instinctively that this needs our attention. We can see that millennials are becoming parents. And it's not just a matter of understanding millennials as parents. It's really a matter of discipleship, right? And I think that's what makes it important to us, is that if 16.2 million millennials are moms now, which is like well over 50% that means well over 50% of millennials are parents. So I think, we started to dig into the different segments of millennials, especially millennials who are now parents. Found myself really curious about how different questions would play out uniquely, specifically with millennial parents of faith. Because I think intuitively we feel some differences, but I wanted to understand what was actually there. And so that was one of the chief passions behind this survey, was to try to understand what makes this distinct and unique.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, it was, you targeted parents of the Christian faith. Did you ask a question about that? Like, was it 100% them?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So we asked about how they, their devotion as a disciple of Jesus Christ. And so the response to that question, we have on this survey, 91% of them consider themselves devoted followers of Jesus. The remaining 9% would honestly identify as, I believe in Jesus, but I would not consider myself a devoted follower.
Gotcha. Now, one of the things that didn't surprise me at all, but I kind of laugh at, was it 49% did not identify with the millennial generation, which I think is funny. What is that about?
Well, okay, so there's a couple things at play here, right? With millennials as a generation and the advancement in access to media, I think there's more exposure about the things that typify this generation, and it hurts a little bit to have it that exposed and have memes made about your generation, that others may not have had to experience in that way. So there's definitely a desire to distance yourself from something negative. But then I do think the other side of that coin is that there is a unique juncture of this generation that would divide it into what I believe are two cohorts within the same generation. So there's two instances that I think give evidence to that, like the way that the tech explosion happened, and then in conjunction with the financial crisis, there was just two different ways of growing up because of that. And so this 49% is a piece of wanting to distance yourself from some negative things that are being said about the generation. But then I think there is truly a factor of micro generations existing within a same label.
What do you think? What are those micro generations roughly, and what do you think is the difference?
Yeah, so a lot of social psychologists would say that there's this older millennial versus younger millennial cohort, and one person on this survey that they just said it this way. They said, I think overall that we are more misunderstood than understood. We're far different than any other generation. And because of the complexity of this generation, plus the micro generations that exist within it, there are differentiations even between the beginning of the generation and the latter portion. So what this person is identifying, probably without even digging into some of the research, is that myself as an older millennial looks at the world completely differently than this younger millennial. And that, I think that's one of the primary reasons you'll see millennials bucking against the generational labels. So with the tech boom and with the financial crisis, older millennials grew up having to learn the internet and didn't really have cell phones until later in high school, earlier in college. They also had a degree of optimism about the economy before the financial crisis hit. Younger millennials had a different experience of that. And so the slow start to the younger millennials didn't affect the older ones quite as much. So there's just a different formative experience within the span of those, 16 years that actually I think we are going to continue to see the effects of for, the next couple of decades. We don't really know fully what that looks like, but I think that's definitely a factor.
I find that I think what you said too about the negative things associated with millennials and then people not wanting to identify with that. And I'm sure some of them are in that early 1980s, range where they almost think, well, maybe I'm not one. Like they probably don't think of themselves as Gen Xers either. Like
Right.
I've seen things about that lost shit. They could like the, I don't know, small
Xennials.
generation of eight, whatever.
Yeah.
Of which I'm a part. But one of the things I laugh at though, with some of the negative labels on millennials is, like my dad is a boomer. And if, when he tells you stories of what he was like when he was 16 or 20 or 20, I mean, it's like, there's no way it's, millennials are worse than, it's probably different stories and different trouble they got into or different, I don't know, growing up that needed to happen. Yeah. But it's almost like you just forget that every generation has those growing pains and things like that. And maybe it looks different, but I think, man, some of the stories from my dad's generation, the ones that nowadays don't even compare. Like, okay, maybe, you know what I mean? So that's just funny. We just have that recency, I guess, bias where we only remember what's happening, in the last 5 years.
And I think that's kind of a fruit of the fact that we do have access to different kinds of media that makes it seem more unique and more like this is the first time this is happening. When in reality, if you really sit down and have conversations with previous generations, it's the same struggle. So it's just a different, we have more access, I think, to the struggle today.
That's true. Yeah. Cause like back then, the trouble that my dad would have gotten in, very few people would have ever known about.
Right. He's not posting pictures of it on Facebook.
Yeah, exactly. Nobody's got a record of that. It's just him and whoever was involved. Versus now, it's like it could be national news in a heartbeat,
totally.
Which is just crazy. So what were some of the interesting things you learned from the survey? I know most of it was what I would call like subjective. You're trying to get them to talk about themselves and their experience and faith and their kids and all that. So what were some of the things that stood out?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I think is, just important to keep in mind is that 70% of the parents who filled out this survey, their children were, 3 and under. And so, I don't know that we can really stress enough how important it is for the leaders in our churches who are responsible for early childhood to really grasp how critical their role is right now at this juncture in our culture, to be able to really support young families and play a part in helping to kind of redeem the millennials church experience. So that was something that I think we, as leaders need to begin looking at our early childhood ministry team with maybe a different lens in the larger strategy of the church in terms of how we reach young families. The other thing that I thought was really interesting is that when asked, how you agree with this statement, if you agree with this statement, I have very few insecurities about my ability to parent my children. Only 31% of millennial parents would say that. And so what that means is 70% are feeling insecure. And so I think there's an opportunity there to be able to come alongside young millennial parents, even though, we kind of live in a social media day and age that wants to project having it all together. They're saying here, I know I don't. And I think we can really encourage them in that. Let's see. Another piece that stood out to me was in terms of a millennial parent's faith formation. 74% of the parents who took this survey grew up in a home that valued faith in God. And then 95% of them would say, my faith is important to me and it influences how I parent. And I wish I could package that up and send it off to those millennial, the parents of those millennials, just as an encouragement of this matters. It really does, have an influence. One thing that was really interesting, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to dig into this more, but 85% of these millennial parents of faith said that they make church attendance a priority. One of the things I want to dig into is what do we mean by priority? Because I'm sure you experience this and leaders listening to you experience this, just the thing we're facing in the church today of irregular attendance. What constitutes a priority? That would be interesting to dig into. And then I think
Quick, I have a question about that. Well, I don't have a question, but just a thought. I've generally thought, and maybe it's because I have young kids. Our kids are 5 and 2. And so maybe this is just my experience. But even in the attendance numbers of our church, I find that attendance regularity is worse in the preschool phase than it is in elementary. And it makes sense to me because as a parent of preschoolers, I feel like, gosh, they're sick all the time. Like they're catching stuff here and there. There's just different things that are going on. If your kids are really young, there's their own schedules and what happened that morning. I don't know. There just seems like there's a million variables. And even Easter this year was an indication where, we like most churches, we have a lot higher attendance at Easter because everybody's coming the same Sunday. But our preschool numbers go up way more than pretty much any other category. And I feel like it's because, well, they're just not here as frequently in the middle. So when you get them all on one Sunday, it's like, whoa. And again, there's no judgment for me because like that's where we are. I kind of get that. I don't know if that's true though. That's more been a gut feeling and then sort of confirmed there. Like when we actually measure frequency of attendance, it doesn't stand out that preschool is much, much lower. So I'm not sure. I really don't know. But that would make sense to me. I wonder at priority, like they probably feel like they are doing a really good job. Yeah. A really good job if they're coming 3 out of 4.
Totally.
And 2 out of 4, maybe it's like, it's good enough, Right. I wonder.
And I think that's just an interesting thing to keep in mind as leaders. And I love you bringing this up because there's this piece to it of, you know what? They might have tried that morning and their youngest got sick or, but maybe if your church has streaming services, they're trying to stream it in. Like, I think really honoring and encouraging the efforts, of a young family trying to get out the door with multiple littles. I think it's an encouragement and it's important for them to hear that that's noticed, more for the relational factor than it is of like, a pat on the back. But I think that's important. One of the other things that really stood out to me, Nick, was, 93% of these parents, it is a high priority to them that their children grow up to know and love and serve Jesus. And I love that. I think that is so encouraging. And as leaders who are responsible for the discipleship of kids and families in our church community, that should just be an incredible encouragement to us. The one thing that I would say that's unique about that, though, is we did ask questions about things related to spiritual disciplines, like reading your Bible regularly. And that's just an area that millennials are struggling with. I think just understanding basic spiritual disciplines in terms of not that they're not legalistic in practice, but that they can be a pathway to life and really knowing Jesus intimately. So I think there's some opportunity there for the church to kind of show a way of how this impacts their discipleship and that their kids need to see, going along the lines of you can't give your kids something you don't have. And one of the ways that you grow to know and love and serve Jesus is by being in his word and being in community. And so I think there's a real opportunity there. Yeah.
Every study suggests people are less biblically literate than previous generations. But for me, a lot of that blame to me goes on not so much the individual as where we are as a culture. There's just more distractions. There's less time in church culturally. I grew up, we went 3 times a week. Now it's common for it'd be good attendance to go 3 times a month. Right. And I'm not saying one is bad or one is good, but there's certainly more that competes for your time, I think. Totally. And so I think if you pulled out a generation like the boomers and put them in, if they grew up at the same time as millennials, it'd be the same problem. Right. So I don't know that the challenge is the solution. How do you fight through that to help them care about it? And it seems to me like community might be one of the biggest things, right?
Yeah, totally agree.
People are doing it and people know how I'm doing and they're asking. I don't know. Just thinking out loud there. But that is certainly not unique.
Yeah,
I think it's across the board. Even other generations in churches today are less biblically literate. And obviously that's going to translate to their kids
I think one of the things that part of it feels like drawing a line to like connecting the dots of this is what you want. Like you want to see your children grow up to know and love and serve Jesus. One of the ways that's going to happen if you actually know and love and serve Jesus in a way to that is through these things, through his word and through community and the things that, he said, we need to be doing. I think there's a piece of that where it's connecting the dot of this isn't legalism. This is a way to life and, helping them see how that integrates with their real life. I love that piece of Deuteronomy 6 where it's really not saying like add all these things. It's just do these things differently. When you're walking on the road, this is a call to a way of life, not just adding in more things.
Which is good news for parents and kids at any age, right? Yeah, because the time is different, but it's always busy. It seems like I saw it was a Pew Research report. I think I referenced this at the panel discussion we were in together at CPC this past year that millennial parents were the most likely to feel like they're doing a good job parenting, and then Gen X was less and Boomer was less. And my thought is, well, of course, the younger your kids are, it's a little bit easier to feel good about that. You're not having the challenging conversations that the parent of the 16-year-old has, or even like our elementary director, her girls are, graduating or in college, and one of them's graduating from college, and the challenges are different. And I would just say it's, the less control you get as they grow up, and parenting can seem harder. So I feel like a Gen X parent would have said the same thing as a millennial parent at that stage, when your kids are 3 or 4, don't get me wrong, parenting's really hard, but it's different conversations about sex with a 15-year-old and whatever than changing diapers or just being physically exhausted.
Right.
They're different kinds of things. What about, I don't know if there are any more like interesting points you want to point out, but I know another thing that stood out to me was what millennial parents are concerned about in regards to church and children's ministry.
Yeah, that was a big deal. So, we asked them, millennial parents of faith, as you're visiting a church, when it comes to the children's ministry, what are you most concerned about? And so we asked them about things like the curriculum and programming, the environment, so like the ethos of the staff and the volunteers, and then safety and cleanliness and security. And there were a couple other options, but by and large, 42% when they're walking into a church and visiting a children's ministry, they are looking for safety, they are looking for cleanliness, they are looking for security. So I think it's really important as children's and family ministry leaders to recognize that this is going to be a growing value of young parents. And I don't think it's a surprise to anyone, but I think it is important to recognize that way above environment and decorations and even the staff and volunteers, and way above the curriculum or programming, they want to know that when they're walking into that space that their child's going to be safe and that it's going to be a safe and clean environment for them to be in. And I think a lot of that is just, you have to take in the backstory of how millennials grew up and what they experienced in the church and just where culture is at right now. So I think that that's an important piece for us to keep in mind. And then, on the heels of that, at about 34% was environment and ethos of staff and volunteers. And in conversations with the survey participants, one of the things that really seems to stand out is how their child is received. And so that those volunteers in the nursery, the way that they receive a crying 2-year-old will determine if those parents come back. And if they feel like their child is going to be loved and welcomed and nurtured in that ministry. So again, it kind of goes back to the importance of the training and the building of the team around that early childhood ministry and the understanding they have of the ways that their spirit is perceived and received by the millennial parents. So those are two things that really stood out as valuable to them. And then curriculum and programming was at 16%. But one of the things that is important to note is that they actually do want to know what their child's hearing about. So I think there's a communication piece of, hey, here's what we're doing, and this is what they experienced today. Because that's a piece that's a little bit jarring for millennial parents, is that I'm dropping my child off for an hour or two and picking them up, and I don't know what happened in that hour or two. So they do want to know. So those were some interesting things about that.
I made a note earlier when you mentioned the early childhood team and the focus, and what was it, like 70% of the survey participants had kids under 3, or 3 and under, or something like that. This may be not an accurate observation. Maybe you can tell me from your experience, but I find sometimes in churches there are too many assumptions made in the nursery / toddler, like that age. Like it's almost run like as if everybody that coming in already goes here and we're family.
Yes.
And so then we don't pay attention as much to how clean it is or how organized it is or what to tell you if it's your first time. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And I think that's one thing I've learned, and I wrote down the note because I'm thinking we need to make sure we come back to this and talk about it again. How good of a job are we doing with the first time millennial family with all of the questions and insecurities, not about them, but about your place, you know, and the concerns. And I mean, that's just heightened. So that's probably something people can walk away with on this podcast and just figure out how good of a job are we doing there. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, especially in the early childhood area, but this is really like that can be extrapolated out to the whole children's ministry, like area environment, is if you have created that environment for insiders. And I'm not saying anyone would ever intentionally do this, but even down to signage, like when I walk in, do I know where to go to check in my child? And if I'm new, like what does that process look like for me? And then where is the room that my child actually goes? Like, is there a really warm volunteer that's at that check-in desk that can actually walk me through and talk me through what that experience is going to be like for my child? So you have to think about it through the lens of, if I walked in for the very first time and had no clue where I was going, how do you create it so that I don't feel like a deer in the headlights? Because that's just, you don't know what it took for them to actually make it through the door that morning. You want to make it as simple as possible for them. And honestly, the more, this might sound bad, but the more that it looks like you guys have your act together, the better that parent is going to feel about dropping their child off in that environment. So that includes, just having things ready for them, the signs out, the people ready, a warm environment to receive their child. It's good to have safety policies on the walls, and it's good, for there to be, the sign on the counter that lets you know what the snack is, so that they can see right away when they walk in if there's any issues with that for their child. Just basic things like that will go a long way with a young millennial parent.
And I definitely think it's more of a concern for millennial parents than it was for, previous generations. But it was even a concern then. There was a survey done. It's probably been 15 years now, maybe even 20. So you're talking about a totally different generation took that survey. And when they, it was about what are the top reasons you came back to church after a first visit? And they were obvious. It was preaching and music were 1 and 2. But the top 4 reasons you didn't come back, I know 2 of them were children's ministry and cleanliness, orderliness of the building. And you're talking about 15 years ago, before all of the concerns that parents have now, and the more we know. And so that's just heightened. So it's always been an issue. Right. But you're right that it's even more important now. That's good. How about with all of the, stuff that you've learned? I know there's some things you recommend in terms of what churches can do to better serve millennial parents. From the survey, I think 65% said they agree or highly agree their church is one of their biggest supports. So that's good. I mean, I don't know if it's great, but it's good. What else can we do? How can we do a better job serving millennial parents?
Yeah, well, I think the first piece, and you kind of referenced this earlier, Nick, but the importance of recognizing maybe what we are biased towards? Like, do we kind of drink in all of the sweeping generalizations made about millennials and use that as a framework through which we see them? Or do we recognize, hey, there's a lot of things common across the generations because we're people? And to really be able to develop empathy for each other is important. And I say this to millennials as well. You have to be able to develop empathy and respect for the ways that you approach generations that are ahead of you and the ways that you're approaching generations coming behind you. Because really, like, if we look at the term generations, Michael Dymock from Pew Research, he said generations are a lens through which to understand societal change rather than a label with which to oversimplify differences between groups. And so I think it's really important for us to first just kind of recognize in ourselves, have I been approaching this group of people with labels that are oversimplifying our differences? And just kind of really, that's a piece of like intergenerational reconciliation that I think is important. We might not even realize that we need that until we really take a look at, actually, I've been framing this whole group of people in this light, and I need to let that go so that I can approach them in love and in good faith. So I think that's the first place to start, is just to ask the question of, maybe have I been oversimplifying this? And so if you really want to connect with millennial parents of faith in your ministry, I think you could do 5 things that are really accessible, really simple. These are not earth shattering, but it's a way to start. Millennials really desire invitation. They want to be a part of something and they want to be in relationship. Now they're busy. And so you may feel like you haven't experienced that, but I think the important piece is to give an invitation. So, hey, you know what? Can I take you to coffee early one morning? Or, hey, do you guys want to just come over for dinner one night? And honestly, in that dinner, I think you will score points if your house doesn't look perfect. Like, they need to know that you're real and that things aren't staged. So have them over for dinner. Don't stress about it. Throw something in the crock pot and just keep it a casual and comfortable environment to get to know them. And then meetups in their spaces. I have one leader that I really love. Her name is Kim, and she will meet up with the moms in her ministry at the park or at an indoor play place, and just get the moms together, and she'll just hang out with them and with their kids. And it's a really beautiful way for her to connect with the young parents in her community. So just invitations to meet up, to hang out, to get to know each other. And then I think another step in connecting with millennial parents of faith is to care about their marriage. This is one thing that's really encouraging about this generation, is they really view their marriages in a term, like under the terms of being a team. They're with most millennials now being both parents working in some way, shape, or form, they approach life as a team. And so they'll, I think that's important. But as a church and as a children's ministry leader, a family ministry leader, if you care about a millennial's marriage, that will speak volumes to them. So maybe it's like coordinating date nights where, hey, you know what, come drop the kids off at the church and go to Starbucks for an hour or two and come back, and we want to give you a couple hours to just connect. Another really simple thing to do is, as you get to know other couples, connect them to each other. And just notice and encourage each other. You know, as they're walking through the halls and they're holding hands, or, you know, maybe, dad is, you know, carrying the baby and mom's, you know, holding hands of the toddler, of just saying, hey, you know what? You guys are doing so great. What a great couple. Those words really go a long way to help those millennial parents feel seen and known. So I think just a key point there is to be aware and to notice and actually say what you're noticing. And then I think another thing would be in how you love their kids. We already talked about the safety and security aspect, but that really is a way to show love. So make sure that you're locking down on that. And then, I would say in how you train your volunteers to greet and interact with parents, is going to be really critical. And the ways that you, share specifics about what you love about their children. Because I think there's something really discouraging for a young millennial parent to be dropping off a 2 or 3-year-old that's really struggling with separation anxiety and to pick them up from nursery and it feel like a relief to the nursery staff that you picked up your child. So if they can say something really great about that child and about what they noticed, it's going to go a long way for that parent to feel like they actually want to come back again, and put their child back in that environment.
And that's one that I feel like volunteers do need help with because there's like I don't know if insecurity is the right word, but just it could be a little awkward interacting with parents, especially first time families and kids.
Yeah.
Some kids will talk to you and be very open first time, and some kids are like, "Don't talk to me. Why are you talking to me?" And so there's almost a fear. Staff probably, and certainly with volunteers, to engage, but we should probably do a good job training them to do that well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's just little simple tweaks that will go a long, long way. And most of the time you're just a couple of, it's a couple sentences, it doesn't have to be a long conversation. I know when you're picking up children from the nursery, you don't have time for a 5-minute conversation, but hey, you know what? I really appreciated the way that Sarah shared toys today. You're doing a great job at home with them. She obviously is learning that from you. Like, can you imagine the way that's going to change that mom's day? So I think those simple things are going to make that parent feel like this is an environment that they want to be a part of. I think another thing is to allow millennial parents to inspire you. So asking them for their ideas, as you get to know them and you've, maybe met them for coffee or at the park, hey, I know that you really care about the discipleship of your kids. And as a leader here at our church, I really want to be able to come alongside parents like you. What are your ideas? What would be helpful to you? And then actually implementing them, the ones that you, have a light bulb moment with and are really sticking for you, implementing them, that is going to help, it's going to help your ministry. It's also going to help that particular parent feel like, the things that they, see and the ideas that they have matter to this ministry. And they're going to begin to find their place in that church family. And that, I think, as we know of millennial generations and their faith experience, being able to connect their talents to the wider church community is something that is really important to them. So I would say just definitely allow them to inspire you, ask for their ideas, and then resourcing them. This is a big deal. We can kind of feel like with the internet and with Google that there's an endless supply of resources at their fingertips. But I think that children's ministry leaders and family ministry leaders have a unique perspective on resources available for discipleship and for just tools specifically related to their kids. So obviously, connect them to God. If you have found a great devotional for moms or for dads or for parents, give that to them as a gift. Connect them to each other. We already talked about connecting parents to each other and then connecting them to those tools. So if you found a really great, lullaby CD, give that to someone, a mom who just had a little one that's struggling to sleep, or, if you found a really great new children's Bible and you found out that, Jason is just learning to read, give that to them. It's just those pieces of noticing and connecting the dots that can really make a huge difference for these parents. So those are just 5 ways. And again, they're not earth shattering, but if we can just kind of incorporate some simple steps into reaching out and creating relationships and space for those authentic connections to develop, I think we're going to be creating environments where millennial parents of faith really feel like they're in an environment where their children and themselves can thrive in their discipleship.
That's good. And we have to get this right because, I mean, you know, if we're talking about reaching kids and families, it's mostly millennials, right? Aren't they the
Absolutely.
largest generation now anyway?
They are. And I think there's some risk to you know, some people call them a missing generation in terms of church and connection. And I don't really feel that level of negativity or alarm, but because I do see the ways that they're engaging. And I put it this way. When you take a look at the capacity and the passion that's inside a millennial, if they can really meaningfully connect with a church community, can you imagine what could happen? I think there's just a lot of hope that we have to approach this with in order to do it well. And so it matters and it's important, and there's so much potential in being able to help millennial parents and millennials in general find their place back in the church. And I think that being able to just develop those meaningful relationships is one step towards that.
That's good. Well, how can people connect with you if they have any more questions or, you know, interested in some of the research from the report and all that?
Absolutely. I'm happy to send this to anybody who wants it. My email is michayla.white@incm.org. And I believe you'll probably put that in the show notes so that they can spell it right. So feel free to email me. And then I'm on social media under Michayla White. I'm happy to connect with anyone there. And then I would encourage people to just visit INCM.org. It's going to connect you to all of the ways that we love to come alongside the community in their roles as champions of discipleship for kids and families. So we just exist to serve that. And I think there's some great resources there for you.
Definitely. Well, Michayla, thank you for, you know, doing some of this research, for being passionately caring about, you know, millennials. And obviously you are one, so that there's a bias there, but we need more of that. We need to do a good job reaching that generation. And I feel like the 20-somethings is always somewhat missing from church. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter what year it is. Rewind 50 years, they're probably, you know what I mean? Yep. So I don't feel like it's any more of a concern now. But in terms of children's and family ministry people, which is most of the people who listen to this podcast, whether it's student ministry leaders or children's ministry leaders, you know, millennial parents are a big target in terms of who they need to serve and who they need to reach and all that. So thanks for doing the research, for coming on the podcast to share this with us. It's been really good. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Nick. I appreciate it.
So did anything in there surprise you? Were there any insights or, you know, findings from the survey that made you think a little bit more, or just something that was a little bit surprising? I don't know. For me, some of it was, but a lot of it was not. You know, I don't necessarily, sometimes there's that negative stigma like we talked about on that generation. I don't necessarily have that. So I can't say anything was really surprising, but it definitely brought some renewed focus. For me, it was like, you know what? We need to make sure we're doing a good job thinking about what it's like to be a parent as a millennial, which, you know, there's some things that are going to be the same as it was for previous generations, and there'll be some things that are unique. Some action items I thought of coming out of there. One is to kind of audit or review your preschool environment. You know, we talked about the importance of it being safe and clean and, you know, organized and all of that, and what that communicates to parents before they ever even trust you with their kid. I think another action item could be to start a focus group just of millennial parents. And, you know, she mentioned that number, the percentage of them that are, you know, have kids that are 3 and under or under 3. So it's going to be, you know, young parents mostly with young kids for the most part. But as much as you can, I would try to diversify that, you know, get millennial parents who have older kids and those with younger kids, and see what you learn and what your church could be doing to serve millennial parents better. You can get all the notes and everything, links, all the stuff we talk about in the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 99. And I hope you subscribe to the podcast. Next week, we have another great interview that you're going to want to listen to. It's episode 100. And we talk with Jim Murphy about how their church and how this ministry specifically plans events. All of us plan events and do events, and I just think Jim and his team do a good job of planning events. They use a certain project management tool with that I think you'll be interested in. So we even have a supplemental video that's going to go with that you can learn the project management tool they use and how they use it. So it's kind of in the weeds about planning events, but I know that affects all of us. So I hope you'll enjoy that. Until then, if you're going to be at the Orange Conference, again, let me know. I'd love to connect. But for everyone, I hope you have a great week, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.